Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Stephen Brown, and in today's video, guys, it's the series where I don't provide the content, and hopefully you don't either, reacting to Armchair GMs on CapFriendly. If you're not aware on how this series works, we come on over to CapFriendly.com, we click on their interactive tab, and we sort through the Armchair GMs that are just for the Toronto Maple Leafs, because that's the team that we're talking about here, and we take a look at trades that people have posted here and see if they make any sense. Sometimes they're absolutely outrageous, but other times, they spark debate, right? They bring up trades that, hey, might actually make sense, and we ask the question, should the Maple Leafs be interested in something like this? Well, clicking on the first one here, it's called Getting Ready for Playoffs TDL. I assume TDL is trade deadline, but they're making a deal with the Minnesota Wild, Justin Hull on a second-round pick for Jordan Greenway in a fourth, and then they're sending Nick Ritchie to the Coyotes as, I assume, a cap dump, and then Axel Rendell in a third, which Rendell's a pretty good prospect, and I guess we'll talk about him a little bit later, for Yanni Hakanpää. Now, okay, usually I don't put too much stock into rumors, but Michael Russo is saying that the Minnesota Wild are likely to trade forward Jordan Greenway before the beginning of next season. I would put some stock into that. Michael Russo is a very credible reporter, and pretty much all he does is report on the Minnesota Wild. But if you're a fan of another team, at some point before next season isn't very encouraging, because you may want Jordan Greenway for your team's upcoming playoff run this year, and the Minnesota Wild may have something to say about that. They're currently 11-5-0 and first in the Central Division. You know who could use Jordan Greenway for this year's playoffs? The Minnesota Wild. And the fact that he's an RFA at the end of this season and not a UFA until 2024. Sure, they could get more for him if they dealt him now, but he'll still have a lot of value this summer, even as an unsigned RFA. At a glance, being 6'6" and 231 pounds, I can understand why people are fans of Jordan Greenway. Over on evolvinghockey.com, and their link will be in the description of this video, the goals above replacement stats are kind to Jordan Greenway, but when we're looking at the expected numbers, there is a huge discrepancy here. And even over on hockeyviz.com, if we're looking at players playing with Jordan Greenway, which are the gray boxes, and players playing without him, which are the red, there are far more players in the red towards the good category, meaning that there are more players that are better without him than they are with him on the Minnesota Wild. And I know that it's just in a sample of 12 games, but as of right now, in this moment, I think that if we're looking at players that the Maple Leafs can acquire, definitely the 6'6", 230-pound power forward in Greenway is an intriguing option. I definitely can understand why you would be interested in him, but I think that we can shoot a little bit higher. And that might piss some people off because I'm saying no to the big guy, but I'm not saying no because he's big. I'm saying no because he's not really playing that well relative to the rest of his teammates. And the reason why you would include Justin Hull in that trade, or any trade in general for the Maple Leafs right now, is because when Ilya Mikheyev and Peter Mrazek come back from their injuries and come off of LTIR, the team will be over the salary cap. They will need to make a roster move, whether that is trading someone or placing someone on waivers. They're going to need to move somebody out. Now, you could get the cap space that you were looking for by just placing a player like Pierre Engvall on waivers and plugging Ilya Mikheyev into his spot in the lineup, because I don't think that Mikheyev would be too much out of place on that shutdown line because he is a pretty good defensive forward. Although that is for sure one of their options, that just hasn't been what's been talked about so far. I mean, Chris Johnston on his own show about a month ago on the SDPN said that he felt that it was close or imminent that a deal involving either Justin Hull or Travis Dermott was going to get done. And Elliot Friedman weighed in on it at around the same time and said that he felt that it wasn't Justin Hull that was going to get moved. It's definitely something that we're going to have to follow, and something that we'll get an answer to in the next couple of weeks when Ilya Mikheyev and Peter Mrazek both come back from injury, because they will need to make a roster move unless there's another injury, of course, that allows them to put more money on LTIR and kick that can down the road. Moving a guy like Justin Hull or Travis Dermott would free up more cap space than just placing Pierre Engvall on waivers. And the only way that I can make sense that the Maple Leafs are willing to deal one of their 7 NHL defensemen when you need defensive depth is because they're going to be interested in acquiring another one or a better one later on in the year. And then if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, why wouldn't they just include Hull or Dermott in the eventual trade that they're maybe going to make for a better defenseman at a later date? And the idea behind trading one of those guys now and acquiring the better defenseman at a later date is that it would give them more cap space in the now. And cap space in the now means even more cap space down the road, because it works like a snowball. The more cap space that you have on opening day, the more cap space that you'll have to work with at the trade deadline. And while Travis Dermott has played well in a third pairing role with Rasmus Sandin, and there's nothing wrong with that, his time with Morgan Rielly this year has been lackluster. And every time he's asked to play higher up in the lineup, much like seasons past, it just hasn't gone well. And it's kind of flip-flopped, where at the beginning of the year, Justin Hull and Jake Muzzin didn't look good at all, apart or together. In the couple of games that Justin Hull has played since coming back from being an extended healthy scratch for like 4 or 5 games or whatever, he's looked better. And if you remember the James Myrtle article that we talked about a couple of days ago, it was reported earlier on in October that Justin Hull had been dealing with some sort of illness through training camp and to start the year. And then in this article from Kyle Cushman over on theleafsnation.com, talking about which players got bigger or taller coming into this year compared to last training camp, it was reported that Justin Hull was down about 7 pounds or so. And if he was dealing with some sort of an illness and he lost that weight in a very quick amount of time, I don't want to speculate, but that could throw a lot of things in your game off, including your skating, your shot, just everything really. And while I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, the clock is ticking and the Maple Leafs will need to make a roster move in the next couple of weeks. As for trading Nick Ritchie in essentially what is a cap dump, I'm not a huge fan of that because I don't want to give up on the guy just yet, but there will come a point in time this season where the Maple Leafs do need to decide whether or not this is working. I do understand the need for that bigger or tougher player come playoff time, but maybe they can allocate that cap space to a similar player who will fill that role a bit better. Now, that was a lot of time spent on that first one, but there's a lot of context to understand when going over the Maple Leafs and how they're going to navigate the trade market moving forward. My criticism of the first one is that I thought that they could shoot a little bit higher, and this next one definitely does do that. And while I'm not agreeing with the trades that they've made here outright, I would be interested in a guy like JT Miller if he is available. And that's a big if, because even after starting the year 6-10-2 and being way outside of the playoff picture at this point, I think that the Canucks don't view themselves as sellers. I think that they view this year as a complete one-off. They don't seem to understand what the problem is, and they're blaming it on just circumstance and bad luck, and that's just the way it goes sometimes. And for a guy like JT Miller, who is signed for this year and next year, I think that they look at that deal and they see him as being part of the solution for next year. But if they do decide to make him available, they could definitely get a boatload for him because the team acquiring him would have him for this year and next year. Now, the Leafs salary cap situation going into next year is already looking pretty tight, and that's even after you factor in the cap maybe going up by $1 million and Phil Kessel's $1.2 million in retained salary finally coming off of the books. They have some key RFAs to re-sign as well as Jack Campbell. They're already going to probably have to move out a couple of middle-tier contracts. Not anyone big, but maybe a Nick Ritchie, maybe a Justin Hull, maybe somebody else. I don't know. I don't know how they afford JT Miller's $5.5 million cap hit. If they're able to get the Canucks to retain at all, that definitely does make it easier, but that will cost them more in the deal. And while that would cost them a lot, I do think that JT Miller is a guy that I would pay that price for. This is a guy who's been excellent over the last couple of seasons. He can play center and the wing, and when Vancouver went on a little bit of a run a couple of seasons ago, he was pretty great for them in the playoffs. And as for defensemen similar to JT Miller, who are not just signed for this year, but one more afterwards, there aren't very many intriguing options to pick from here. I don't really want to speculate on restricted free agent defensemen, so looking ahead to guys who are going to be UFAs at the end of this year, there isn't a clear list of names that we can talk about. I mean, Ben Sherratt probably is going to be available because Montreal isn't doing so well, but I don't know how well he fits the Toronto system. I mean, last year in the playoffs, he played great against us, but Montreal played a really passive style, really defensive game, borderline a neutral zone trap, and Ben Sherratt is a slower guy. I don't know how he fits in on that Toronto blue line. A guy that I may be a little bit biased towards because we went to the same high school, obviously not at the same time, but Mark Giordano may be an interesting option. The Kraken at 4-12-1 don't look like they're going to repeat the success story of the Vegas Golden Knights in their inaugural year. I know he's 38 and he's not what he used to be with the Calgary Flames, but he's a hometown guy, and just watching him over the years with the Flames, he's a warrior. You want a guy to block a shot with his face, Mark Giordano is that guy. And I mean, he still is playing over 20 minutes a night with the Kraken, albeit in a slightly different role than what he's been used in with the Flames, playing more offensive zone starts than he is defensive zone starts this year, but the numbers still are good. If we're taking a look at the expected goals above replacement, he's still finding a way to be effective 5-on-5 defensively and offensively, and even on the penalty kill for the Seattle Kraken, if we're taking a look at the actual goals above replacement, the offensive numbers go slightly down, but that defensive value is still there. Like I said, maybe I'm a little bit biased towards this, but yeah, it would be really cool. And it's not like the Maple Leafs have the guy on their team that Giordano played with for years in Calgary already or anything. If I'm being honest, in an ideal world, I would like to see the team add another top 6 forward and a decent defenseman going into this year's playoff run. Acquiring both isn't going to be cheap, asset-wise and in terms of cap space. And yes, if they do decide to move out a Travis Dermott or a Justin Hall and let that space accumulate or accrue, they will have a decent amount of space to work with come the deadline. But a guy like Giordano is not cheap. I think his cap hit is $6.75 million. And unless you're getting a lot of salary retention on both the players that you're acquiring, it would be tight to acquire a guy like Giordano and a top 6 forward as well. So although I like the player, it may not be realistic based on what this team needs and what they have to work with. But that's going to be it for today's video, guys. Let me know down in the comment section, because ideally, of course, you would want them to acquire both top 6 forward and a decent defenseman. But if you had to pick between one or the other, which one would it be and why? And as for the Nazem Kadri game worn jersey, I picked that up at the Sport Card and Memorabilia Expo that took place at the International Center last weekend here in the GTA. I got it from the Real Sports booth, and when I saw it in person and just how beat to hell this thing is, it made me really miss Nazem Kadri, and I just couldn't pass it up. So that's going to be it for the video, guys. Make sure to like the video if you did like it, and subscribe more, because more is always on the way, and I'll see you in the next one.